Vocations and the African American community. I would just like to maybe build on the image that we have, and then to allow these two young gentlemen here, because the one group we have not heard from, or that group that we're going after, people who are of their age. So I think that what they have to say is far more important than anything that I might have to say. But I do think that I like to think in images, and the title of this, African American Men and the Fertile Soil for Vocations, that maybe in many ways, rightly or wrongly, that soil has not been tilled or cared for recently, and so it has been laying fallow for many, many reasons. Some have been shared here, perhaps some reasons that may yet reveal themselves, but I do believe that God is calling men to the priesthood. I do believe that God is calling African American men to the priesthood. It's, my own priesthood has been a wonderful life, and I found great, great joy in serving the Lord. And so it is my firm faith that God calls us to joy, and that God calls some to know the joy of the priesthood. But as we all know, going back to that image, if you don't do something with the soil, it's not going to produce as abundantly as you want it to produce, or it may not produce at all. So maybe for, as I said, many of the reasons that have already been expressed here, maybe the soil of vocations in the African American community has been allowed to lay fallow, and that is a wonderful opportunity, because as you know, when you kind of revive soil, it produces abundantly again. So I do hope that this symposium and some of the ideas that we have come up with and will concretize hopefully this afternoon, that will bring about an abundant harvest, because I can only go on my own experience, and my own experience is that the joy of my priesthood has far outweighed any of the challenges or any of the struggles, and it's a life that I would highly recommend, and I think it is a life that God continues to call young men to, and also young men from the African American community, because it is very important that we be producing vocations from our community to serve our community. So those are kind of my opening reflections, and I will be very interested to hear what these three young gentlemen have to say with regard to this topic.
Stephen and Adam, can I start with you and tell people a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Would you like to go first? You're the senior.
Or just the. Well, my name is Stephen Batten. I'm from New Orleans, born and raised Catholic. Is this better? Can you guys hear me? Do you want just general introductions from both of us, and then? So yes, born and raised Catholic. Attended public schools in New Orleans and Catholic universities for higher education. And that's a general introduction. If you want me to, or do you want me to? Oh yeah.
Why don't you just say?
Do you want me to just
do your whole thing and then?
Okay. Well, then, yeah, I'll back up. So, I went to Xavier University in New Orleans for my undergraduate degree, and also took classes at Loyola Jesuit School in New Orleans before coming here to Notre Dame for the MTS, and I continue here for the PhD program, and I'm currently in the 5th year of that program, and hopefully will be graduating sometime next year. The role of Catholic faith in my life, or the Catholic Church, has been somewhat ambivalent early on. I was not, as you all indicated that you were, brought up going to a Catholic school, nor did my family force me to or encourage me to go to church every Sunday, though my grandmother did, my mother didn't. So it wasn't until college that I really began to contemplate seriously what it meant to be Catholic. One of the things, however, that I've been thinking about, and I was prompted by some questions that were provided to us for this panel. One of the things that I've often thought about in relationship to my own faith and where I've found nourishment in the Catholic Church is at the intersection of the Church, its theology, and its relationship to society. That interest began to come to fruition at Xavier during my undergraduate years. And so when the question was asked to us, what do you believe are some of the challenges and opportunities for African American men and women being interested or having a vocation as priests or religious in the Catholic Church? I thought about this question and the challenges and the opportunities in terms of the intersection of church and society. And so one of the things that strikes me every time I think about these sorts of things and issues related to the church, and even the issue that we're speaking about for the symposium, has to do with a comment made by St. Paul. And I'll just read this briefly. In his letter to Galatians 2:7-10, Paul writes, "When they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised, and when James and Cephas and John, who were acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. They asked only one thing, that we remember the poor," which was actually what I was eager to do. And so when I think about the challenges of African American men and the challenge to cultivating vocations to the priestly ministry or any other ministry within the church, a vocation to any ministry within the church, I often think about it in relationship to the reality of African American men in the inner city, since that's also where I'm from. And I just wanted to share with you just a few statistics that I think about and I think are important to think about when we reflect on enabling the call of enabling African American men to answer the call that they may already be receiving. In March of 2006, there was a New York Times article that talked about the plight deepens for black men. And so I'm not going to read all this, and my time's probably up. But I just wanted to say that throughout the 1990s, though it was a good decade for the country, it was one of the worst decades for African American men. And the number of, there were 50%, by 2004, there were 50% of black men in their 20s who lacked a college education were jobless. And there were 72% of high school dropouts among African American men in the inner city. And so if we're thinking about vocations to the priesthood, and that goes through higher education, I think we also have to consider that the low numbers may also have something to do with the fact that there's a serious social and economic problem that needs to be addressed by society at large, but can also be addressed by the church in general. And the seeing priests deal with this concretely, I think, would also be a way of cultivating vocations among African American men. And I'll just stop there.
All right. I think I'll begin with a caveat, which is that my experience may be more idiosyncratic than it is paradigmatic. So, in other words, what I say about myself might not be typical. So, if you want to extrapolate about black youth in general, I just ask that you would do that with care. So my name is Andrew Prevost, as many of you know. I'm a doctoral student here in systematic theology at Notre Dame. I grew up in a two-parent Catholic household in a predominantly white suburb outside of Denver, Colorado. And I had two sisters, and I was the middle child in between them. Both of my parents and my extended family originated from the Houston area of Texas and various parts of Louisiana. And in that context, they would refer to themselves generally as Creole, which was a term that seemed to mean being at least technically black, though probably somewhat light-skinned, and having at least some kind of cultural attachment to a French Catholic environment. In Colorado, no one knows what Creole means. Any of the possible meanings of Creole are not really known. So in Colorado, we were the black family in a mostly white neighborhood. Although I am currently married, I actively discerned a possible call to the priesthood for roughly 7 years, from my junior year of high school in 1999 all the way through my second year of master's work here at Notre Dame in about 2006. So by active, I mean that I thought about it regularly, sought out spiritual direction, visited seminaries and religious orders, and kept a journal where I would try to make sense of the signs in my life, things where I thought that God might be speaking to me. And I did that for years. So without going into too much detail about my whole life story, which I can tell you all later if you're interested, I just want to point to three things that really drew me to the priesthood for a while, but also three things that made me hesitate and that I think ultimately led me down a different path. And I hope that these two lists will be helpful as you continue to think about this problem. So, first, what was appealing about the priesthood? In the first place, there was the grace that I received from a very active prayer life that was mostly encouraged by my mom, who had a conversion experience in the early 90s, which she was raised Catholic, but she was nominally so for when I was really young. But in the early 90s, when I was maybe 8 or 9 or 10, she became very fervent and started to have a strong devotion to the Eucharist and the Rosary and the saints. And all of this had a really big impact on me in my adolescent years. And so we'd often pray together. A second factor that drew me in was being involved in the church publicly. So I was an acolyte. When I was a little bit older, I also was a lector sometimes. I would help my dad usher. And I was involved in other programs that the church had going on, including CCD and service projects and youth groups and things like that. And the third factor is maybe one that needs a little more attention, and it's namely this, a frightening sense of alienation from the surrounding culture, which tended to misunderstand and also to react negatively to my Catholic identity. So I'll speak about that a little bit more. Basically, the idea is that my experience of not fully belonging in other places was sort of a negative motivation for thinking about whether Catholic religious life would be more welcoming, would be a place where would be a way of life or a setting where I could feel more at home. And the reasons for this, or this sense of alienation or estrangement began really in high school, where, I was gaining a lot of self-consciousness, and I realized I was very different from most of my friends, Catholic and non-Catholic, black and white. Few of them really seemed to get my spiritual side. They didn't understand when I said, "Oh, I'm going to daily mass," or something like that. That didn't make any sense to them. And sometimes I felt kind of negatively judged for being that way. And I actually identified more with some of my Protestant friends who were a little more religiously zealous, but I still felt isolated as the only Catholic who would go to their Bible studies and that kind of thing. I went to college, and this feeling of estrangement intensified. I went to Colorado College and majored in philosophy, and this was a very secular institution, and it was a place where diversity was highly prized, but Christian identity was scorned. So being black was actually a sign of prestige. You were different, and that's what all of the privileged, leftward-leaning white students wanted to be. So you were actually kind of a rock star. It's sort of the, Kanye West, Oprah, black celebrity was sort of what you were automatically on campus. Whereas being Catholic, or being Christian in general, was actually a stigma. Christianity was taken as a sign of naivete, backward thinking, social oppression. And so the real marginalized group on campus were the Christians. So all of the programs on campus were designed to make me feel okay about being black, but I really just was trying to feel okay about being Catholic. So I think that's an interesting factor to consider, because what I was really looking for was a compelling vision of life which could deal with all of the questions in the world that had been coming up. My first week of college was included September 11th, 2001. So I was just in the dorms, and then all of a sudden it seemed like the world was going crazy, and I was, how do I make sense out of this suffering? How do I make sense out of who I am in this history? And I thought that a religious answer to that made a little more sense than just kind of vague multiculturalism. But it was hard to find a place where I could explore that more. So I thought, well, maybe if I become a priest, maybe I will have this compelling vision of life, and I can really feel at home there. So those are the three positive things: prayer life, public involvement in the church, but also in this weird way a sense of alienation from society, which made the priesthood seem kind of like a possible refuge. On the other hand, though, I'm not up here in a collar. So what happened? That's you all might be wondering what happened, because I was very drawn, and I would say that I did have a call. I heard people calling. People would tell me, "Andrew, aren't you going to become a priest?" People in my parish were saying this. I felt a responsibility. I felt like in some ways, maybe I needed to do this for the Black Catholic community. But there were certain things that made me hesitate, and so I want to share those with you as well. The first and most obvious is that I was also discerning a call to married life, and my spiritual director encouraged me to date, and so I tried to do that with limited success for many years. But here at Notre Dame, I found a really strong companion and source of strength in my life, and so that made the calling of marriage real to me. Another factor was that I was increasingly convinced that I had an academic calling. That is, that my own strengths and weaknesses were leading me in the direction of a life spent thinking about things, studying them, researching them, teaching them. And so I thought for a while, well, you could be a priest and a scholar, and so that was an option. But in a way, it was really the scholarship that seemed to be where the Spirit was leading me. So the priesthood and ministerial involvement was less I wouldn't say less important, just less central, maybe. And I still was getting some pastoral needs met, some of my pastoral longings fulfilled through lay ministry. And the final factor that I want to talk about is has to do with the second one. So, why did I want to study theology? Why did I want to spend all this time thinking about things? And I believe it was because society and my experience of the world had raised all these questions that I didn't feel like I had adequate answers to. And so I just wanted to continue exploring those questions. And I wasn't convinced that the priesthood would really allow me the freedom to do that. And that's because I think that the Catholic stance toward the modern pluralistic culture that we live in, with the histories of colonialism, slavery, racism, sexism, has sometimes been, at the risk of being blunt, has sometimes been a little simplistic, honestly. And I think that I, and maybe some people in our generation, need more sustained reflection on those kinds of problems. So the question then that I want to leave with you all is, do Catholic priests, including bishops, spend enough energy listening to the precise existential questions which young people of color are asking today? There are lots of answers and insights that the Church provides. It has a lot of wisdom to share. And so the real challenge to me seems to be how to share that wisdom in a way that really addresses where people are at in this very confusing time. And part of that means, I think, really questioning the whole category of race itself to some extent, and identity. So I've heard other people talking about identity crises, and I think that's a common factor in our generation in some ways. I think it also means really speaking to the history of what's been going on, and so without rambling on and on, I'll just leave it at that, and say that in conclusion, maybe all of this just means that I'm not the kind of person who really is called to be a priest. The fact that I'm so plagued by these issues, maybe that means that really I should probably just be a professor. But on the other hand, maybe this does indicate something about things that need to change about our understanding of the priesthood and what its roles are in our society. So thank you.
I am a Johnny Gibson. I am a junior at St. Augustine High School in New Orleans. I attend St. Peter Claver Catholic Church in New Orleans. And I am discerning the call to priesthood. When I was asked to be a part of this panel, I was posed with a few questions. The first, which was, how do the young people, the young men, view vocations? Going to an all-boys school, that question comes up a lot. Young men view vocations as this very scary thing, this very scary part of life. They view vocations as joining a priesthood, but being isolated from the rest of society. Joining a priesthood, but being ostracized by society. They see, young men see the crisis. They see the abuse, the sex abuse scandal. And that's what they view vocations as. Having to address that and being judged by society by that. But also, young men view vocations as a way, as something that's drawing them away from the normal society, from the money in life. Vocations is up against the society that we live in, the rap culture, the money, drugs, sex, those issues. And so when you come up with this idea of vocations, joining the priesthood, they don't see the joy in the priesthood. They don't see what God has put in this ministry. And they don't see this personally for a few reasons. One, because they do not have a connection with their priests. They do not have a connection with their bishops. They do not have that fatherly figure or that fatherly feeling which God has bestowed upon you all as priests, as bishops. The second thing, they do not feel that the church is answering the questions that the young people ask. They feel as though the church ignores the young church of today, as though they're not important now, but they're important only to foster vocations. When we look at vocations, we also have to talk about what else God has called young men to do. But the part of it, what God has called young men to do. God has called us to serve Him, but in many different ways. And so to foster that, we have to preach to them how to serve Him. Serve Him in the priesthood, but also show them the joys in married life. In my own discernment process, I guess the call that God revealed to me is weird in a sense, because I knew from a young age that God was calling me. Not many 5-year-olds go to their grandmother and ask them to make vestments for them. But from a young age, wanting to be involved in church, wanting to learn more about what God has called me to do. But also, my vocation, my call per se, was fostered through family. And when we look at vocations, we have to think about that also. A key component of the Catholic faith is the community sense, the family. Many young men today live in a broken family. I go to a school where I see that. And when they come to school, there is a sense of family, a sense of brotherhood. But that's only there. And so when we look at vocations through history, the family encouraged their young men to go out and to be priests. Well, the young men today do not have that. And so the job, per se, that we have to foster that family atmosphere, that connection, that love that fosters the want to serve God. The thing that repels young men from becoming priests is the question, if you want to be a priest, stand up. Why isolate those few? Because what happens after that, that's the deterrent. When you have to walk through the halls and say, ha ha, you want to be a priest, you don't like girls, stuff like that. But in my experience, in November, I went to NCYC, the National Catholic Youth Conference. And among those thousands of young people, there were few of us who were African American. But when young people share in the faith together, that's a different story. When you do not isolate those few who God has called to serve in the priesthood, but you call all young people for whatever call they have in life, that brings out the need and the want to serve God in the priesthood. When we call for ministry, many young people, their want, the desire to serve God is called through ministry. But through ministry, there are two issues. One, they're afraid because they feel like they're being called out. Two, they are dealing with someone who is pushing them, pressuring them. God calls us in many different ways, and He knows how to get us, but He does not pressure us. He puts the invitation there, and it's our choice. That's why He gave us free will. Our choice to answer that invitation. So, all too often, I guess if I'm speaking from personal experience in youth group, we have a call to join the ministries and such. I'm an altar server at my parish. And the call to ministry is, oh, I see so many young people here on Wednesday. Why are you not at the church? Well, when you put it like that, you're deterring the love that the church the gospel supposedly preaches. And so when we look at vocations and calling young people, yes, we have to be hard about it, but we have to show the compassion and the love that God has for us to the young people, that He has in the gospel. When I think about what will draw me into becoming a priest, I think about not only the joys, but I think about the suffering and how in my suffering, in my pain, I can find joy in Christ. Many young people do not understand that. How do we understand that? By young people take in things by watching. You notice young people dress the way they dress by seeing other people do it. And so if they do not have a model of love in the priesthood, a model of love and compassion for God, a model to find the joy in the suffering, they're going to be deterred from that life. They're going to go to the life that makes them feel comfortable. The life that that's calling them, that's open to them, that's speaking to them in the way that they see. So many young people, like I said before, do not see their priest. Well, they see their priest on the altar, and that's it. They do not have that personal connection with their priest. As priests, you are called to be fathers, spiritual fathers, to the flock. And the part of the flock is the young people. Young people in spirituality, they view spirituality differently from the older generation. In a sense that they worship God in their own way. It's kind of hard to explain that. I noticed at school, I give the retreats, and when I took on that responsibility, I was kind of timid on how my response was going to be from my peers. But one of the retreats, the sophomore retreat, I found it interesting how their response, how in silence, when you give them something to think about, how you actually put a voice in their head, how God has called them, their spirituality comes out. And so I'm going to close by saying vocations for young people is fostered by putting the thought in their head and allowing them to think about how God has called them through the many different things that He's put in their lives, the many different people He has put in their lives. Yes and no. Yes, there's a support system as those people who are just always going to stand up for those people who are getting pushed down and jeered at. No, because those people who would want to stand up are afraid of what those same people might say to them.
I actually come from a single-parent home myself, which maybe that's why I'm not a priest. I don't know. 'Cause like, it's not too late. I think for me, coming from New Orleans, seeing the things that I've seen, coming from a single-parent home, those are the kinds of questions and concerns that I do have myself. How does the church respond to these young men? And that's part of what I was trying to get at in my reflection, because you have children from broken homes who are seeking a father figure. A friend of mine years ago in New Orleans said whenever he'd go to the Y to play basketball, a black man would walk in, and all the young men would flock around him, or however many was there, they'd have groups flock around them. And it's true, we don't really see many priests interacting with young black men, or black priests interacting with young black men. It was a black priest who got me interested in theology when I was in undergrad. That was the first priest that I had really encountered and talked to, and who had taken the time to really to really engage me where I was at that point at an intellectual level. And so I think that is, at least for me, that is the question.
Let me just see if anybody else got a question.
I can just start briefly and say, one of the things that helped me to see marriage as a real calling was the sense that marriage is also a vocational crisis in our society, and so, and as you point out, I think really well that the two issues are related, because it's the family in some ways that builds up, informs young people in such a way that they might consider a priestly vocation or another vocation, but unless you're addressing that family issue, then there won't be that, and I think it might help to talk about how marriage as well requires all of the same kinds of identification with Christ and personal sacrifice and responsibility for the community and all of those kinds of things in a similar way that the priesthood does. I mean, in a different way, but I think sometimes marriage can seem like the default option for people who aren't actually called to holiness. But I think that's a mistake, and I think the call to marriage is really is in some ways a hard one to follow in this society.
I think part of the dilemma is that maybe, I think in the past there were some foundational elements on which you could build, marriage and the family. I think one of the things the church faces is that the floor keeps dropping, now with the whole question surrounding marriage and our effort to save marriage, all of a sudden you have to go even deeper to deal with some of those questions. So I think Father Raphael's point that and when the floor drops again, all of a sudden the bigger picture is even more diluted, and it's more difficult to see. So I think one of the challenges is what is the basic foundation from which we can begin. Very often in society, that basic foundation becomes something else, and we're that much farther removed from where we need to be, and we have to go back even farther to find ways or to find answers to bring us to where we need to be. I hope that makes sense.
To build upon what Bishop Farber said, the basic foundation, and the church's vision, and with the family, the basic foundation, which much of the African American community especially, is the foundation in Catholic education, knowing what your faith is about. What you go to a Catholic church, but what are you doing? What is your faith about? What does the Catholic Church teach? And to foster vocations, the family, be it broken or united, must be grounded in their Catholic faith, must know what their faith is about. Because if you don't know what your faith is about, somebody will tell you otherwise, and that's what you're going to go with. Mm-hmm. And so in the family, that's the ground to foster vocation. That's the church's vision, to be rooted in your faith.
But I think Johnny alluded to it, and I think you're speaking to bishops and priests, and more three things we can do to interface with this conversation. Here I am, trying to what should I be doing with the young men?
I guess. Number one, actually talking to young men. Having a conversation, just simple conversation with young men. Number 2,
Let me stop you. I'm a psychologist, so I've got a probe.
okay.
What does that mean?
Having a conversation with young men, just saying hello, asking what's going on and how are you doing in school, what's going on in your life, how is your personal life, what struggles are you going through, just simple stuff like.
So I'm that person. I'm saying, so why do you want to know this?
Understand.
I just met you.
Right.
I asked this question. So what's up with that? You know, the kids say. You know. So I'm pushing because as you first want to get pretty concrete. It's just not how you doing, what's going on. What's that about?
Being able to reach out, knowing to tell the young person you have someone who is praying for you, who's looking out for you, who cares about you, even though this might be the first time you met. You're a child of God, and you're one of my sheep, and so I'm going to take care of you.
That's number one. What's number two?
Okay, number 2, showing young people the joys of prayer by yourself praying,
Prayer life.
by having a strong, solid prayer life.
Patrick? Where's the names? 3?
Number 3,
We'll come back.
I'll come back.
It might only be 2. That's right. Steve and Andrew, you want to answer that same question?
Might as well go in.
I would just second the conversational aspect, but I wanna accent listening, listening carefully, and I would say listening carefully to what people are trying to say, because sometimes they don't always have the words, and so you might even have to help people find the language to express what they're dealing with, because the current world is really overwhelming, and so you might have to help them find the categories to just make sense of their experience, but in order to really understand what are they dealing with, where are they coming from, and then but then number 2 is really to show how the Catholic faith and relationship with Christ and prayer and the sacraments and works of mercy and things like that can really speak to those struggles that they're dealing with. And so because I think that Christ is really at the center, but it's not enough to just proclaim Christ into a void. It has to, I think Christ has to come and somehow be mediated to them in their concrete struggles.
So you think it's important to not just talk about the Gospels and Christ, but it's got to be a context.
Right.
It's got to be a context that integrates into their lives.
Yeah. So in short, then I think those are the foundational things, and then vocations can grow out of that love of Christ that seems relevant.
Well, I agree with everything that's been said, and I just want to note that with respect to conversation, I think you don't necessarily. I'm not sure the first response of a young person would be, "Why are you talking to me?" Because people, especially from fragmented homes, they want someone to speak to them. They want an adult figure, especially a male figure, to reach out. So. Prayer, listening, Christ. I would also say a priest who is talking about the church, but talking about the church not necessarily in reference to the seven sacraments, not talking about the church necessarily with respect to doctrine, but talking about the church as a people, talking about the church as a community, and saying explicitly that that the priest understands himself to be doing what he's doing because of his responsibility to others, and to make that known explicitly, and to say and indicate that this is what the community called church does, whether or not you're a priest or you may be married, but even when you're married, it's not just about your responsibility to one another, to you and your spouse, but it's a responsibility that your family also has to the community. So that'd be one thing. Two, with respect to interfacing with people, I think a concrete thing might involve looking at what people are doing with respect to the struggles of their everyday lives. And so in Baltimore, I believe, a few months back, they had a convention called the City from Below. I'd be interested to know how many priests were involved in something like that, where grassroots movements are trying to have accountability for their own lives and for their own community, because there's a sense of community there. And I'm not sure the church is tapping into that and tapping into the strategies that these grassroots movements are using. And the third point I would make, that I guess you could say is a subset of that, why not go outside of the church? I've heard a lot of people speak about the youth being involved in mass, and I think that's good. But the church is where you are. So then why not go outside the church? Go to these grassroots movement, or participate in these grassroots activities, and start to imitate them by maybe having an urban garden, and then the youth and the community and their parents, whether there's two parents or a single parent, could be involved, and then you get interface with the youth that way, and then they see what the priesthood is about, and then maybe at that point they'd even want to come to church if they aren't Catholic. I'm not sure if you're trying to bring people who aren't even in the church yet to invite them to join the church and become priests.
Johnny, did you think of your third one?
Yes, both of my fellow panelists hinted on it. It's important to see priests in action, not just at the altar, not just in the pulpit, but out in the community, preaching the gospel, but doing what God has called you to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to do what you preach at the pulpit. That's a deterrent for young people, and even people who look at the Catholic Church from the outside. What is the Catholic Church doing? We're seeing your faith in action.
Johnny's a reflection on the strangeness sometimes of the priestly question. I mean, I walk around campus all the time, and I'm always interrupting people, and I do say interrupt because I do interrupt them. They're on their way someplace, and I'm always stopping people and making them late. But the reality is, the more you are in a place at a constant time, they recognize that you are in this place at a constant time. At some point or another, somebody's going to ask you, "What are you doing here?" And it's at that point that you are able to engage. I mean, campus ministry, for example, campus ministry is really a paradigm for church life. Really is. And at some time, campus ministry is simply loitering to a purpose. For the most part, it's loitering to a purpose. I mean, you got all these degrees and all this stuff. The bottom line is, you got this bag of tricks, so you can whip it out when it's appropriate. and we don't really often see ourselves as priests. We don't see ourselves in that way, and our institutional posture in this present age does not help, because we are encouraged to be more administrators than we are to be people in relationship. Especially those of us who are engaged in the pastoral life and in institutions at the base level, because we have more money problems than anything. And we are looked upon as being people that are supposed to do the miracle of making these books that are imbalanceable. And so, consequently, it's very easy for us, extremely easy, and that's part of our problem. It's extremely easy for us to lose the vision of ministry. We forget what we're supposed to be doing. And I really believe that it's more important for us to be able to somehow structure a way of constantly reminding people that some part of your day has simply got to be to loiter to a purpose. But the second thing, and this is a question for Andrew and Steve, it's a matter of information, and it's not rhetorical. It is a matter of information. How engaged are the two of you as theologians with black theologians and PhDs?
Sorry, you mean
How engaged are you with black theologians?
other black theologians? You mean?
Catholic theologians and
Oh.
PhDs?
You mean personally, or in terms of studying black theologians? Both.
I can say that somewhat, somewhat engaged. I
guess if I can paraphrase, I think one of the pointed questions is, do you know other black theologians is probably a good place to begin. And if so, are you...
Does BCTS mean anything to you?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I took a class when they were here over for a while. Jamie Phelps taught a class on Black Catholic theology, which I took. So I got to meet her, and through that I met a few other members of the BCTS. And then I also part of my funding was paid for by the Fund for Theological Education, which is not Catholic, but it supports Catholic and Protestant theologians of color. So they have a conference every year, and there's a kind of a community of young black scholars that I met through that.
Right. I'm familiar with the BCTS because I'm from Xavier. So I know Jamie Phelps. So I didn't take the class. I've taken but I have I know black theologians and also well, yeah, I mean, basically what Andrew said, I'm in the same boat. I'm pretty much in the same boat.
The reason I ask is because, there's just about in the BCTS in terms of membership. And membership means simply that you have a PhD and you're Catholic and you may be a theologian and maybe not. And the purpose is to have this group engage each other. And the purpose of my question was that your list of questions are the thematic of BCTS. I guess I would encourage you, and now I will bother you.
Fair enough.
It's very important that, in my journey, I know personally that if it wasn't for someone who said, Norman, you're going to take my place as a priest, and that happened at a very early age as an altar boy, and when somebody asks me about my journey in priesthood, I can go right away to that moment, that time, and who it was. And I wondered just as we're considering and we're contemplating and desiring the Holy Spirit grant us this strategic plan, that we would be called by name. Were you, any of you all, at any point in your journeys, told by a particular priest or someone clerical that you should be a priest? You can be a priest.
Well, I have a few different instances, but the most interesting one was at the March for Life in D.C. We were at the march, and two sisters who did not know who I was.
Sisters or sisters?
Two nuns came who did not, for the first time, they saw me for the first time. I was leading the chant that that the students that we were singing, and they came up to me and they said, God is calling you. You're going to be a priest. And that was the first time I saw them and the last time I saw them. Interestingly enough, on a daily basis, in class, when we have class discussions, my classmates tell me I'm going to be a priest. My teacher, even he hinted to it. In the book that he assigned to me, it's dealing with the Catholic Church in New Mexico, but he says you're going to be a priest. So those are just my experiences in that. Yes, Monday night at my confirmation, Archbishop Hughes was before his homily. He personally called me out I was on the first row, and he said, "God is calling you." At my confirmation, before his homily, he said, "God is calling you."
How do you feel about that?
How I feel about him becoming a priest,
Those
or
comments
the
just made.
comment? As you all know, Ajani has had the anointing upon him since when I shared this earlier with Nancy. Ajani, let me just give you a little background. Ajani is a product of premarital sex. Okay, so he's not the Lord. We were married after, actually. We were on number 4 when we got married. And so, but Ajani actually was the cause for me to develop myself spiritually because of where he was and the 2-year-old. And that was my Mary moment because I was like, God, what have you done to me? And so, if that's God's will for his life,
My parish priests planted the seed early on. One of the biggest influences was also my mom and all of her Rosary Group friends who were actively campaigning for this for a while, and I think some of them are still holding out some kind of hope that something will happen, and I don't know, but and then one last anecdote. One of my philosophy professors in college, who was an atheist, was very scared that I was going to become a priest and was strongly trying to discourage it, which was, another way of kind of hearing a call,
Yeah. A priest. I've never been told by a priest that I should become a priest until recently. But in the past, there was at one point in my life a time when I encountered 2 non-Catholics who thought that I had either studied in seminary or was a priest or was going to become a priest. And all I can say is that when they said this, it kind of frightened me, and that was my response, and I kind of haven't looked back.
Is there anything you all want to say to Andrew now, as a group?
Wait,
So